um, later on. But basically in the infants we have all the congenital defects which can be of those congenital defects. As I was also going through, there are congenital defects also of intrinsic factor itself also. So intrinsic factor in congenital deficiency can also occur, or there may be a functional abnormality which is also an autosomal recessive disorder, and this will also present in the first, second, or third year of life. So it could be either the defect in the intrinsic factor as well, or in the intrinsic factor receptor, that is this Emerslund Grasberg syndrome. And also there could be a defect in the so in the intrinsic factor as well, in the intrinsic factor receptor also, and then also in the transport of the transporter of cobalamin, that is transcobalamin. So there could be also a selective deficiency of transcobalamin as well. So all these are the congenital causes of cobalamin metabolism in itself. And this defects of transcobalamin deficiency, these are the defects of Emerslund Grasberg syndrome, which is where the receptor is defective, since because the enterohepatic circulation is continuing, and the other specific, so there's a selective specific as absorption of intrinsic factor will be affected. All the other ileal absorptions would be going on in normal way, and gastric secretions and those functions of parietal cells, that is the gastric acid secretion and the amount of intrinsic factors, since they are normal. So the only deficiency would be that be in the cobalamin level. And then with transcobalamin and then that would present by about 1 to 5 years of age. This transcobalamin deficiency, now briefly about this as well. This presents usually within a few weeks of birth. So serum cobalamin and folate levels may be normal. That is because because the child has some maternal stores of cobalamin, as he actually has stores because of the maternal transport of cobalamin. But the anemia responds to massive, that is these people with these children with the transcobalamin deficiency, those with transporters of cobalamin where they're deficient. So they respond to massive doses of cobalamin, injections of cobalamin, that is 1 gram 3 times weekly, which actually causes the free cobalamin to enter the marrow cells by passive diffusion in the absence of functional transcobalamin. So this is the rationale behind use of these mega injections of cobalamin in those infants, basically because this can present with megaloblastic anemia within a few weeks of birth. And there the transcobalamin, the transporter is deficient. So by injecting mega doses of cobalamin, we can cause the passive diffusion of cobalamin into the marrow cells, so as to overcome this megaloblastic anemia. Some cases they show neurological complications, and in some cases the protein is present in normal amounts, but it's unable to bind cobalamin. So it could be either a transcobalamin sort of a mutation in the transcobalamin that may lead to deficiency of cobalamin, or an abnormality of there could be the deficiency of transcobalamin, that is the deficiency of the transporter, or there could be an abnormality in the transcobalamin transporter, that is transcobalamin, that would affect its binding with cobalamin. So that or either it does not bind to cobalamin, or the cobalamin transcobalamin complex does not attach to the surface cell epithelium, or is functionally inert. So there could be
That
defects in
might be
either the
quantitative and qualitative defects, means both of the defects. Might be called quantitative or a qualitative.
hello. Yes, this is sorry, I couldn't hear you there very clearly. So it could be the qualitative or quantitative defects. Yes. So genetic abnormalities found, they include mutations of an intraexonic cryptic slice mutation. Actually, I'm just reading this I'm also correlating this with Hofbrand at the moment. So
Yes, Swapnalia, I'm following that. I've also
okay.
opened it.
So
Thank you
I
for
was
this.
correlating this because I thought we would actually go through this side by side, and then it would also make sense. So the genetic abnormalities they found include mutations of an intraexonic cryptic splice mutation, and extensive or single nucleotide deletions. So these infants do not show methylmalonic aciduria, but malabsorption of cobalamin occurs in all cases and reduced immunoglobulins in some. So, failure to institute adequate cobalamin therapy or treatment with folic acid may lead to neurological damage. So, here basically now, just to summarize, I think this is all just that either the intrinsic, there could be congenital intrinsic factor deficiency or abnormality, um, where the child could actually go even the because the maternal stores are there, so they present by about first to second or third year of life, and then mm, and then variants of course also, and then also there could be intrinsic factor receptor deficiency where the child would also present by about late in 1 to 5 years of life with defects in the tubulin and amnion receptors, and also if there could be a visit transcobalamin deficiency or abnormality where the transport is normal, so these are then treated with mega doses of cobalamin. And then regarding another of this is the like the maternal, I think we've done the infants in the maternal deficiencies and in the elderly the deficiencies. Then also the gastric causes, in the gastric causes they had mentioned this H. pylori. So H. pylori is also because the H. pylori infection can cause can cause food cobalamin malabsorption. Basically, that is H. pylori, along with the long-term use of histamine H2 receptor antagonists. So H. pylori and H2 receptor antagonists and proton pump inhibitors and chronic alcoholism, and now all these causes can be can combined lead to this food cobalamin malabsorption. In this, there is a failure of the normal intrinsic factor where it binds a mediated mechanism of cobalamin absorption requires that the adequate gastric output of acid and pepsin to ensure the release of food cobalamin. Basically, the cobalamin from in the first it binds with the R binder in the salivary, which is secreted by the salivary glands, and then in the gastric mucosa, the acid pH it causes it to dissociate from the R binder, and then it binds to components in the food. And then this actually releases it from the R binder that has bound cobalamin initially. So if this acidic pH is not there, it does not associate from the food bound cobalamin. So even if the intrinsic factor is still there, it will not be able to bind that cobalamin. So this is what they meant, because the absorption would occur only if intrinsic factor has bound the cobalamin. So if the cobalamin is there in the diet, but the food, but it is food bound, so there will be food cobalamin malabsorption in those cases. And this is more common in the elderly. Where of course the gastric mucosa may be either atrophic or there may be use of H. pylori infection. H. pylori infection causes simple atrophic gastritis, whereas in cases of pernicious anemia there is widespread gastritis affecting all the three layers of the gastric mucosa, and also the body and the fundus may also be affected. So in simple atrophic gastritis as an elderly, there also even an H. pylori infection with a H2 receptor antagonist and chronic alcoholism, and also all these autoimmune disorders like Sjogren's and systemic sclerosis, there could be food-bound cobalamin malabsorption. So the syndrome is associated with low serum cobalamin levels and with or without evidence of cobalamin deficiency. So there would be low cobalamin, serum cobalamin levels could be low without any without the evidence like raised serum levels of methylmalonic acid or homocysteine levels. So there would be just isolated cobalamin levels are low, whereas the serum levels of methylmalonic acid and homocysteine may still be normal. Because of course the intrinsic factor would only bind us that would only cause the absorption of intrinsic factor bound cobalamin. So a minority of patients with food cobalamin malabsorption may go on to develop clinically significant cobalamin deficiency, but the frequency of occurrence and reasons are not. So this is known as, sometimes is known as food cobalamin malabsorption, or also protein bound B12 malabsorption. in which case the mostly if those patients which are given a high protein intake diet like egg yolks, etc., they may also cause inhibition of this B12 uh, mal uh, like they may also cause deficiency of B12 because of food bound cobalamin. And so mostly most of these patients, they just require a dietary sort of an intervention. And then another of these so absence of this was all about uh, this food bound simple atrophic gastritis because of food cobalamin malabsorption leads to a mild to moderate deficiency basically of cobalamin, and the levels are mildly low in these cases. And then this is mostly the gastric causes. The gastric causes with gastritis, and then also with pernicious anemia that is basically the autoimmune component of the gastritis. And this leads to I think we'll go into pernicious anemia in detail the later part of this. And regarding the intestinal causes, they have referred to all of those, of course, those reasons that lead to ileal malabsorption with Crohn's disease and bacterial overgrowth, because bacterial overgrowth is also because of antibiotic abuse is also documented, which shows that there could be elevation of methyl malonic acid. This is bacterial overgrowth in small intestine may also cause spurious elevation of serum methyl malonic acid. So even if not only do the bacteria themselves, they actually cause a decrease in the serum B12 level by consuming the B12 for their rapid growth in the intestine, but they may also cause a spurious elevation of serum methyl malonic acid. And removal of most part of the ileum, like the terminal ileum, also causes malabsorption of cobalamin. And those patients following ileal resection, particularly if the ileocecal valve is incompetent, the colonic bacteria may contribute further to cobalamin deficiency. So this bacterial overgrowth problem, this comes with mostly with the antibiotic associated, it could be antibiotic associated bacterial overgrowth of certain organisms. And or it could be due to intestinal resection, which leads to colonic which colonization of bacteria from the colon. And also the bacteria themselves can cause spurious elevation of methyl malonic acid. Then regarding tropical sprue, there is absorption. The malabsorption may persist in the principal abnormality in the chronic form. And the patient may present with megaloblastic anemia or neuropathy due to cobalamin deficiency. And absorption of cobalamin usually improves after antibiotic therapy. So those with tropical sprue, they mostly have these receptors in the intestine, the ileum, that are affected. But here, not only the cobalamin is therefore because large parts are affected. So not only cobalamin deficiency would be there, but also folic acid deficiency combined could be there. So in the early stages, we need to also give them not only antibiotic therapy but also folic acid therapy. And malabsorption of cobalamin occurs in 30% of untreated patients with induced enteropathy and correlates with the degree of steatoria. So this is all about and this improves with, of course, with the gluten free diet. When there is no gluten free diet is introduced, so all these changes can be reversible in the early stages. Then regarding another thing regarding the infestation in the gastric, there is the H. pylori infection. In the intestine, there is this fish tapeworm or Diphyllobothrium latum infestation, which can cause which accumulates the cobalamin from the food, rendering this unavailable for absorption. And so people who eat raw or partly cooked fish, they are most prone to this fish tapeworm. So fish intake, that is raw or partly cooked fish intake that occurs in areas like Germany, Japan, and North America and Russia. So there, this fish, partly raw or cooked fish, this could intake could lead to this fish tapeworm, that is Phyllobothrum militum, and this then accumulates the cobalamin from the food. And megaloblastic anemia or cobalamin neuropathy can occur with a heavy infestation with the worm high in the small intestine. And there many carriers have no cobalamin. So this could depend. The cobalamin deficiency with fish tapeworm is could vary with individuals. Then regarding those with we've not mentioned any sort of an age range for patients who have chronic pancreatitis. That this could be a secondary to basically, I think, alcoholism, where the dietary cobalamin attached to the gastric R binder is unavailable for absorption. So here also the causes, just like if the gastric acidity does not cause it to dissociate from the R binder protein, so even the chronic pancreatitis could cause lack of trypsin, which could also lead to unavailability of the cobalamin to bind to intrinsic factor. So here, this is also a sort of a cause of cobalamin deficiency. And the here the malabsorption of cobalamin has been reported even in Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. So, those with chronic pancreatitis, and it's thought that there is a failure of release of cobalamin from R binding protein due to inactivation of pancreatic trypsin by the high acidity, as well as interference with the binding of cobalamin. So another rare causes could be, of course, this radiotherapy and all those chemical chemotherapy-induced folate and B12 deficiencies, and certain drugs also. Most notorious are the H2 blockers, but also metformins can also decrease the gastric basically absorption of because metformins have a role of basically causing lowering blood sugar by inhibiting the absorption. In some way inhibit the absorption of those complex sugars from the GI tract. So they may also decrease the absorption of these other vitamins. Mostly these B12 deficiencies may occur with metformins and protein pump inhibitors because of increasing the gastric pH. And also oral contraceptive pills may also affect cobalamin release from food and cause low cobalamin levels. Then cytotoxic drugs and anticonvulsants, they may also cause direct bone marrow suppression, and therefore make a lead to anemia and other megaloblastic changes in the bone marrow, which may mimic some sort of these B12 deficiency even. So all these causes of drugs and infections, that is in the stomach, it could be the H. pylori; in the intestine, it could be the fish tapeworm, Diphyllobothrum militum infection. And then there could be medical conditions um, uh, autoimmune disorders and those cancers, which lead to either gastric resection or ileal resections, and other sort of infections like the chronic pancreatitis and Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. So all these could cause a variable degree of megaloblastic in adults. So the main age group is the infants and children, and then the women of childbearing age and elderly, and in other people the causes could be basically varied from all those causes of infection, inflammation, and those drugs and diet also. So I think we have gone through most of the causes of these cobalamin deficiency. One thing that we have not mentioned so far was this nitric acid, which inhalation, which causes acquired abnormality of cobalamin metabolism. Here, the nitric oxide, the nitric acid oxide, irreversibly, the nitrous oxide, that is NDO, it irreversibly oxidizes the methyl cobalamin from its active, fully reduced cobalamin state to an inactive cobalamin precursor. So basically, the active cobalamin in the case of nitric oxide, the active cobalamin is converted from its reduced state. The reduced cobalamin, that is the cobalamin 1 plus, that is the one which is active, and it is converted to its inactive state, that is the cobalamin 2 plus. This has been shown to inactivate the methylcobalamin and methionine synthase. So regarding this, the reaction of methionine synthase. Methionine synthase actually causes this conversion of methyl homocysteine to methionine in the presence of methyl cobalamin. And in this reaction, this could be affected by this nitric oxide, because the here the cobalamin is converted from its two into its 1 plus state to its 2 plus valency state. So it is converted from its active to its inactive state. So in the 1 plus states, that is we can remember that the number 1 is basically the active one, and the number 2 is the inactive one. So in its 1 plus state, this is a state where the cobalamin actually complexes with the methionine synthase. Just a recap here, if regarding the valencies, they cobalamin just 3 positive, it is the most oxidized form, and this 3 plus this most oxidized form is the one that is transported by trans cobalamin, and it then enters the the, from the endocytic lysosomes. It passes to the cytoplasm. So the cobalamin, once it is bound with the transcobalamin, that is in its hydroxycobalamin state, and then when once it is released from its hydroxycobalamin state, it is the 3 plus valency, which is the most oxidized form that is present in from the that is released from the endocytic lysosomes to the cytoplasm. So in the cytoplasm, it is in its 3 plus most active, most oxidized form, basically. The most active will be the number 1. Okay, so this is the most oxidized form. This is the least least sort of available or active form. From this, it then converts into its like active form, a less inactive form, that is a 2 plus state. This 2 plus state would not cause conversions, would not this 2 plus is only important for its entry into the mitochondria. So from the in the 2 plus state, and this then enters the mitochondria, and then again it's only the 1 plus cobalamin state, which is the reduced form of cobalamin, which causes both the reactions. It can combine with methionine synthase to form the to cause the conversion of homocysteine to methionine, and in the mitochondria also, this is the cobalamin 1 is the state which causes the conversion of methylmalonic CoA to succinyl CoA. So a 3 plus is the form that is released into the cytoplasm, and the 2 plus is the form that is then goes into the mitochondria. But whenever it is going to cause a enzymatic reaction, when it's going to participate in enzymatic reactions, it is going to convert into its reduced form, that is the number 1 form, the cobalamin 1 plus. So that is how we can remember. So once, so basically in nitric oxide, nitrous oxide inhalation, it is converted from its active reduced forms to its inactive cobalamin form, and and it will this inactive form, it does not then participate in the methionine synthase reaction, and this occurs in both humans and experimental animals, and was those who have prolonged exposure to this anesthesia, mostly in intensive care units, the neuropathy resembling cobalamin neuropathy has been described in even in dentists and anesthetists. So not only patients may show signs, but also those anesthetists and dentists who are exposed to passively to this nitric oxide, they may also show this sign of acquired abnormality of cobalamin metabolism. And here, the recovery from the nitric oxide exposure requires a regeneration of methionine synthase. So, not only there is an activation of the methylcobalamin, but simultaneously, even the methionine synthase, it becomes also inactive, and it will remain inactive in that state unless it is regenerated. And for this, the treatment is actually, is this protein is damaged by the active oxygen derived from the nitric oxide cobalamin reaction. So methionine synthase, once it remains in its in its like inactive state, once it does not basically combine with the active form of cobalamin and participates in the reaction, that methionine synthase may in fact be even damaged by the oxygen derived radicals of the nitric oxide cobalamin reaction. And the recovery requires regeneration. So what we do give them is basically we need to give them a methyl cobalamin. That is for the conversion of we need to give them methyl cobalamin, which so as to bypass this conversion state. So we do not need to give them hydroxycobalamin, because hydroxycobalamin would not be converted, would not bind to the methionine synthase, which has been absent. So we need to give them methyl cobalamin so as to bypass this cobalamin one state. The methyl cobalamin in its like pharmacological dose, it would cause the it would associate with the methionine synthesis that is left and cause the conversion of homocysteine to methionine, and therefore overcome the barrier that had been there because of methionine synthase being degraded.
Dr.
So
Nadia,
either
can I
we
add
can
one thing?
provide new methyl cobalamin. So, yes.
Um, I was written that the synthetic form of the methylcobalamin, which mostly they because I think this is one of the past paper question, that is cyanocobalamin. That is actually the
Yes.
synthetic form of the methylcobalamin that is mostly frequently used all over the world for the treatment of these cases.
Okay, so the pharmacological the cobalamin that we use, because methyl cobalamin is of course the intrinsic, that is that one that is formed within the body, that is I think the methyl cobalamin, because cobalamin also occurs in adenosyl cobalamin state, which is in the mitochondria, in the methyl cobalamin state, which is in the lysos, which is so it occurs in the hydroxycobalamin state, I think, where it is complex with the transcobalamin. Then in the adenosyl cobalamin state in the mitochondria, then methylcobalamin in the cytoplasm, and the one you were referring to is the cyanocobalamin, which is the one which is the pharmacological preparation of cobalamin.
Yes.
Yes, I think so. So you are suggesting that if we give that cyanocobalamin, that could replace the methylcobalamin and convert with. So basically, in this step, like if you look at this reaction, even homocysteine going on to since homocysteine is going to be converted into methyl malonic to methionine. So for this conversion, we need a methionine synthase complexed with the cobalamin. Now this cobalamin is mostly the methyl cobalamin that we have, and either we can provide that, or as you have suggested, it could be either the cyanocobalamin that could be used for these patients. And there is also some other reference to methionine synthase, that even this protein, this can be even this can be regenerated by some dietary interventions, like taking red meat and dairy milk, and like all those fish, chicken eggs, which contain the B12. Even they have this methionine component there. So dietary intervention for proteins and methyl cobalamin, or you can say like pharmacologically cyanocobalamin, can be used for overcoming. So this reaction can therefore then be basically triggered to go from homocysteine to methionine, because otherwise the intrinsic sort of cobalamin is not being synthesized, and intrinsic methionine synthase is deficient. So we could go about either supplementing the cobalamin that with the cyanocobalamin, or we could then even add a methionine rich diet so as to cause the synthesis of methionine and methionine synthase within the body.
Mm.
So there are two ways we can go about this.
Mm.
So there is either a dietary intervention or this pharmacological intervention for nitrous oxide, because we need to. There's a block in the there's a block basically in the conversion of homocysteine to methionine, and this can be overcome by uh, uh, either the supplementing the cobalamin or supplementing the methionine. So this is, I think, all about the I think the causes of cobalamin deficiency. So I think then we'll go on to the tests to confirm the diagnosis of cobalamin. That is, we had gone into the test for MCV and the blood film examination, and also the causes of these macrocytic anemia and megaloblastic changes in the bone marrow. They are typical features of clinical cobalamin deficiency, but they are not specific. So the absence of a raised MCV, this is something I think that we need to highlight also, that the absence of a raised MCV does not exclude basically um, the diagnosis of cobalamin deficiency. So and so then we need to do the serum cobalamin levels. Serum cobalamin 1 is the free form, and then transcobalamin 3 and 2 and 3 were the bound form. Transcobalamin 3 is the also known as the holoheptocorin, and 2 is the holotranscobalamin form. So it is these tests can also be done. However, by chemiluminescence assay, these the levels of these the variants of cobalamin can be done, but they have not actually specified any sort of a reference range here. And they say that the overall coefficient of variation of performance between different assays is 5 to 15%. So this coefficient of variation, when it exceeds 5%, so this actually shows a poor sort of a specificity of these sensitivity, and with method biases of plus 10 to percent or minus 20% from the all laboratory mean. So these values can show differences within laboratories and between laboratories also, and some assays may give false normal results in sera with high titer anti-intrinsic factor antibodies. So it is not entirely clear what should be regarded as a clinically normal serum cobalamin level, although it has been proposed that a serum cobalamin level of less than 148 picomole per liter would have a sensitivity of diagnosing 97% of true cobalamin deficiency. So this is so like, although we have all those transcobalamin 1, 2, and 3 levels that we can do, but the most the sort of diagnostic still remains the serum cobalamin levels, and if they and the value that is proposed is less than 148 picomoles per liter or 200 nanograms per liter. So this can diagnose up to 97% of the true cobalamin deficient individuals. And it is even less clear what levels of serum cobalamin represent subclinical deficiency, that is a low serum cobalamin in the absence of clinical symptoms. So an additional problem in comparing different assays and results from different laboratories is the units for reporting. So not only is there a difference in technique and laboratory sort of standards, the standardization of procedures for variation, but also different laboratories also report it in different ways. Some report it in the picomole per liter range, and some in the nanogram per liter range. So conversion of some picomole to nanogram would be 1 picomole per liter is equal to 1.355 nanograms per liter. And despite the absence of an international reference method of measurement, an international standard is available. So although there is no reference method for measurement, but as international standard is available against which they have actually reported all these values. So this can facilitate in harmonization of reporting in the future. So establishment of reference ranges by individual laboratories can be challenging because the serum cobalamin level can be affected by many variables like diet. Of course, it will vary with the use of oral contraceptive pills, metformin use, vitamin supplements, and diet, pregnancy, and so there are so many variables that have to be taken into account regarding the values that we may get with the basically, whenever we come across any serum cobalamin level, we need to go into the history of the diet, the pregnancy status, or any vitamin supplements that they're using. So the levels would vary with the sort of dry diet and drugs that are being used by the person at the time of testing. The laboratories may then report these results adjusted in relation to the assay bias. So there is actually a lot of wide range of gray zone for this subclinical deficiency. So explanation of assay sensitivity and specificity by a laboratory may be done by a receiver operating characteristic curve analysis. Okay, so this is all about like the statistical importance of this and to define the evidence of metabolic disturbance due to cobalamin deficiency. Now, we then gone across plasma homocysteine levels. They will also be raised, and the plasma methylmalonic acid levels. So they have also mentioned values for this as well. For cobalamin, we had the less than 148 picomole per liter range, which was mentioned for 148 picomole per liter or 200 nanogram per liter for serum cobalamin. Then for plasma homocysteine levels, the deficiency of cobalamin results in elevation of plasma total homocysteine. And the plasma homocysteine is a sensitive biomarker of cobalamin deficiency and increases early in the course of deficiency, sometimes preceding symptoms, and progresses as the deficiency worsens. And this can also be elevated in folate. So one of the basically pitfalls for plasma homocysteine is that it is elevated not just in cobalamin, although it is very sensitive for cobalamin, but it is also elevated in folate deficiency and in B6 deficiency also, and in patients with renal failure and hypothyroidism as a result of certain genetic polymorphism. So not just folate, but also folate, B6, B12. So in all these and in patients with renal failure also, this homocysteine may be raised. And in the clinical laboratory, plasma homocysteine is measured by a variety of techniques, and there is no consensus on the reference range, although most laboratories regard a concentration above. So for this, the values for the cobalamin, we had a value of 148 picomole per liter, and for that is less than 148. For this, the value has to be more than 15 micromole per liter. So that was like picomole, serum cobalamin levels were in picomole, and this is in micromoles per liter. And the major drawback, of course, is that firstly, it is not specific for cobalamin, although it is sensitive. So it does respond to, if it is a cobalamin deficiency, it will be raised, but it is not specific for cobalamin. It will be there also for B12, folate, and B6, and also renal failure also. And then it is a major drawback is also that the sample collection and processing is critical, as the sample must be kept cool. That is, when it is collected, it must be placed on ice, and then centrifuge and the removal of the red cells should be done within 2 hours of collection. Otherwise, the breakdown of cells can also release this homocysteine and cause false positively high values. So plasma so this is one of the major drawbacks that needs to be taken into account when we are interpreting results. That is the sample needs to be kept on ice for as soon as it is collected, and it must be centrifuged and removed from the red cells. That is, it must the plasma homocysteine would only give a like reliable indication of the plasma levels if the red cells are removed within 2 hours of collection. Otherwise, after 2 hours, when the red cells will show signs of storage changes and signs of degeneration, they may cause